So what we do in Disruptive Thinkers is every month we come together for a monthly meeting, and we basically bring all different people from the military and entrepreneurial aspects together to network and talk. And one of the things that's important is that there's really no rank in these discussions. So in aviation, we have this adage called no rank in the cockpit, and it comes from crew resource management. And crew resource management comes from a bunch of crashes that happened in the 1970s and 1980s, where co-pilots and pilots weren't communicating with each other. So a junior co-pilot had information he was not giving to a senior pilot. The senior pilot thought he knew what he was doing and literally crashed in a mountainside, killing 250 people. Well, the aviation industry saw this as a problem. And so because this was a problem, they came up with a series of systems to combat this problem and make it so that within a cockpit setting, anybody who's in there can get any piece of information, and you're encouraged to be assertive and have that leadership to make that decision. So sometimes I think we shortchange our young leaders by looking at their rank, and I'm guilty of this as well. About 2 weeks ago, I went to visit a SEAL team, and as I was walking in, I saw an ensign walk out. And the first thing that went through my mind, and this is me, and I was being bad, I'm like, oh, he's an ensign, he doesn't know anything. I'm like, Ben, you have to stop yourself from thinking that. He's an ensign who's an adult who has a wealth of experience you don't even know about. And I always reference one of my favorite stories. So one of my best friends just joined the military about 2 years ago. But prior to that, he had been a White House aide. He had worked for the Secretary of Defense. And on a daily basis, as a 25-year-old, he was briefing admirals and generals. He then went to get a graduate degree and elected to go into the military because he wanted to find something else to do in his life. If you put his uniform on as an ensign, he would no longer be allowed to be in those meetings and offer his viewpoints in those meetings in a lot of cases. So here we have someone who's very experienced, and now they have even more experience than they did previously, but because of their rank, they are no longer taking this seriously. So when we talk about innovation, we have to step back and say, you know what, I'm going to ignore the person's rank for now, who are disciplines still required. We have to take their ideas on board and listen to them for what they have to say. And that's one of the reasons I'm not in uniform right now. Because when we talk about innovation, it's important to have that one-on-one discussion. I don't want you as an enlisted person to see my rank and feel inhibited from offering solutions. Because honestly, some of the best solutions I've ever heard have come from junior people to me who understand the world better than I do as it's evolving, and I can take those lessons and apply them to whatever I'm doing. All right, next slide, please. So what are some lessons we can learn, and what are some things that we can do to start thinking disruptively? First is to always be willing to question the way things are. Sometimes they'll be wrong, but sometimes we'll get to have people think in ways they didn't otherwise. So my article that I published 2 months ago, I had no idea it would be as popular as it was, but I said some things in there that were pretty outside the box, and also said some things that were blatantly wrong, mostly about the Naval War College. And I got a lot of feedback from that, and I learned from that. I was wrong in that regard. But it started a discussion that was very important, and it seemed to have resonated with a lot of people. When we think about procurement and funding issues, we should start thinking more outside the box. It seems like we want to decentralize things, and innovation is all about decentralization, but we have this massive structure in place that doesn't allow for commanding officer authority to distribute funds. And what I think we might want to do is give commanding officers a discretionary $10,000, $15,000, $50,000, whatever they think, to allow young innovators to apply ideas. So one thing I've been considering as our squadron is taking the lecture model that we have, where an instructor pilot like me stands in front of a bunch of students and prattles on for half an hour or an hour about some subject I may or may not know about, and transition that to an online learning model, like Khan Academy. So what education is doing these days is, instead of having a teacher simply stand in front of an audience and give a 2-hour lecture, is the students will actually go home, look at the lecture themselves, they'll come back into the classroom, and then we'll interact with the teacher on projects, work on homework in the classroom, get that one-on-one tutoring time they need. Well, I want to do this in the squadron. I want to put all our lectures online in a format being able to be delivered by tablets and iPads. What if our commanding officer had $50,000 and you know what, Ben? That's a great idea. Here's $10,000. You can go buy the iPads to make it happen. You can go buy the hard drives to make it happen, and the systems to make it happen. I think there'd be a lot of good opportunities for young innovators to kind of see their projects come to fruition immediately, instead of having to wait for a 2- or 3-year procurement process that may not be in line with the realities of the current situations. Next, please. So you also have to be well-read. And this doesn't just mean well-read in terms of military literature or even innovation literature. It's well-read on everything. Reading about psychology, reading about particle physics, reading about chaos theory, reading magazines you wouldn't normally read, Wired, Fast Company, The Economist, things like that to get you thinking outside your normal mode of operation. And as you do so more, you're going to become adapted to different ways of thinking, different ways of understanding the world. Understand that computer scientists are probably thinking about the world differently than political scientists, or that behavioral economists are thinking about the world differently than psychologists who don't have that economics background. And through that, you're going to be able to figure out the world a little bit better. Additionally, we need to start looking at sites like Kickstarter or Khan Academy. I mentioned Khan Academy earlier in relation to learning, but Kickstarter. What if we had a procurement system that was online where a guy in Afghanistan could say, you know what, I want this product. I'm going to put it up on this military Kickstarter website. We can have civilians bid on a solution that they have, off the shelf or otherwise, and then have congressmen or whoever the actors are who are funding things come on the site and say, I want to sponsor this project. I want to make this happen. Let's get a rapid acquisition project out there. And we have these systems in place, it's just they don't work very well. One of my really good friends, who's a Marine Corps officer, submitted 3 awesome ideas. One was to transform the way that they did power production in Yuma, submitted it to the Marine Corps system, didn't hear anything back. Pinged them back, didn't hear anything back. Pinged them back, didn't hear anything back. We need to have a response and dialogue mechanism in place for these innovation inboxes that we think that we want to have. Next slide, please. Next, we have to interact with people outside of our normal networks. And so this really is disruptive thinking at its best. It's meeting those people you wouldn't normally associate with. So here in Norfolk, it's a lot of military people, and everywhere you go, you're probably run into one. But there's got to be some entrepreneurs somewhere. Some people who are creating new projects when it comes to education, or new projects who are architects, or things that can kind of bend your mind and have you think about things in a different light, and learn about new aspects of the world that you can hopefully translate to your current part of the world. Next slide, please. So you all know what this symbol is. This is Apple. We've talked about it many times. But go to the next slide. How many of you know what this is? So I've got 3 people, 4 in the whole audience. This is Next. And Next was the computer company that Steve Jobs owned prior to Apple. It was an utter and complete failure. He poured tens of millions of his own dollars into this, thinking it would revolutionize the computer industry, and it didn't. It was an utter failure. But from this, he learned valuable lessons, and now those translated directly into Apple and one of the best companies we have on the entire world. So we need to allow innovators to fail. We need innovators to make decisions and come up with innovations that may not be successful. And this doesn't always mesh with our current system of one failure and you're out. If you have things like DUI or assault, yeah, absolutely, those persons should be out. But if you make a leadership mistake, say you're a junior officer, you're a JG, and you just completely mess something up, you're trying to institute a new leadership trend that you've heard about, you shouldn't necessarily be punished on your fit rep for that. This should be a great learning opportunity for your CEO to say, you know what, Ben, you screwed up. This is how you could do it better. Let's see if you can implement some of these lessons learned. And then once you see that improvement, okay, this guy can learn. He's grown from what his mistake was. Let's continue to promote him and keep him on the innovative track. When we look at historical examples, one of my favorite books is Rules of the Game. And this talks about the evolution of the British Navy from Trafalgar under Nelson to Jutland under the British system in World War I. So during Trafalgar, Nelson had this brilliant idea to basically let his commanders go where the battle was. He had a generalized game plan, but he allowed a lot of flexibility and a lot of innovation amongst his ship captains. Over the next 100 years, the British Navy basically fell into a lot of traditions, fell into a lot of this is how we will do stuff, very rote maneuvers for their ships, and there wasn't a lot of adaptability in that. And so when Jutland came around in the mid-19 during World War I, which ended up being one of the biggest naval battles in world history, they lost the Germans because they were not able to adapt to the requirements of the age. So we have to allow for adaptations to occur. We have to not let our traditions get in the way of innovations. Next slide, please. So finally, we have to understand that the world is adapting faster, is changing faster than we can adapt. So many of you guys recognize this as the MRAP, and this came about because the enemy didn't do what we thought they were going to do in Afghanistan and Iraq. We're working on hypersonic cruise missiles with DARPA. We're working on next generation fighter airplanes. We're working on Virginia-class submarines, and the Taliban says, well, that's irrelevant to us. Why don't we just create IEDs? And so we killed a lot of people because we hadn't adapted and hadn't had a system in place to think about those ideas previously. So we came with a solution, the MRAP, and it ended up being wildly successful. We need to allow more innovation in the procurement system to allow for these innovations to come to the fore sooner. When we think about procurement, a lot of times we think of capabilities as opposed to potential threats out there. So with capabilities-based procurement, we get awesome widgets and we get things that are really cool to play with, but sometimes they're not the most relevant. And even though those are important for threats that may emerge in the future, it's also important to have a procurement capability that will allow us to have money available to shift into funds that are required immediately. I look at the A-10, which is being retired very soon. It seems to me that when we look at the Joint Strike Fighter, and the Air Force thinks that the Joint Strike Fighter is going to be replaced with the A-10, I just wonder what's going to happen when a Joint Strike Fighter wing gets ripped off by a couple cannon rounds from the ground. Well, if an A-10 case, the A-10 survives. The Joint Strike Fighter case, maybe not so much. So we have to think about what capabilities we want to maintain and what threats we face in the future. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, I'm actually very optimistic about our future. Sometimes I raise some issues that I think are could be worked on better in the military. But I see our current generation, both of leaders and young people, as changing the world. And I like to call us the innovation generation, the I generation. We think of new ways to solve problems, and we like to implement those ways. And I see us as we rise to the ranks, we're going to understand the requirements of this. And I think forums like this are really, really important to continue that discussion. And with the Press Calora here in the future, in the next couple of minutes, we're going to do a breakout session where we talk about some ideas that you guys have and how we can integrate new ideas into the military system. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I'll entertain any questions that you might have.